The last of the fever broke at dawn. Dr. Cassius Wren peeled the biosensor patch from the small blue forehead and watched the readout flatten into safe numbers. The child, a Tessari girl no bigger than a human 4-year-old, with luminous silver hair and ears that tapered to delicate points, exhaled once deeply, and her skin dimmed from the hot cobalt of distress to a gentle, resting cerulean. Her oversized amber eyes stayed closed. She was asleep. Genuinely asleep, not the shallow fever drift of the last 3 days. Cassius leaned back in the creaking chair and pressed his palms against his face. His hands smelled of antiseptic paste and boiled masu root, the Tessari fever remedy he'd learned from a dead woman's journal 6 years ago. 6 years running this place. 6 years of fevers and fractures and children who flinched when an adult raised a hand too quickly. He stood, knees popping, and moved to the corridor. Dawnlight flooded the long hallway of the Alcira home through panels of cheap thermoglass. The building had been a grain storage depot before Cassius bought it with the last of his severance pay from the Colonial Medical Corps. 2 stories, thick walls, a courtyard with a functioning well. He'd turned the upper floor into dormitories, the ground floor into a clinic, a kitchen, and a schoolroom. The courtyard held a garden where the children grew things: tubers, climbing beans, a stubborn row of Tessari ghost flowers that bloomed silver at midday and smelled like cold rain. 23 children lived here now, all Tessari. All orphans of the Rithane Corridor War, a conflict that had burned through 4 systems and left behind a generation of small, luminous, parentless beings that nobody in the galaxy seemed to want, except for the people who wanted them for the wrong reasons. Cassius walked the dormitory hall, counting heads through half-open doors. Rai and Tomas, the oldest at roughly 12 standard years, slept in the corner room with the younger ones between them, a habit they developed on their own, bracketing the small ones like sentries. In the next room, a cluster of 5 had arranged themselves in a heap, limbs tangled, their skin pulsing faintly in sync as they dreamed. Tessari children synchronized their bioluminescence during sleep. It was involuntary, communal, something their species did to regulate cortisol analogs. The first time Cassius had seen it, he'd stood in the doorway for 20 minutes, unable to look away. He counted 22. The 23rd was Leal, the fever girl in the clinic downstairs. All present, all breathing. He paused at the end of the hall, hand on the railing, and let the quiet settle over him. It was the kind of quiet that only existed in the minutes before children woke, a fragile thing, like the surface tension on water. In 30 minutes, this hallway would be chaos. Bare feet on floorboards, arguments over who got the blue bowl, Tomas trying to convince the younger ones that ghost flowers were edible, they weren't. And Cassius had explained this with a patience that surprised even him, using diagrams. Each of the 23 had arrived differently. Rai had been the first, brought by a cargo pilot who'd found her in the wreckage of a transit station, silent, methodical, already organizing the other survivors at an age when most children couldn't organize their own shoes. Tomas had come 6 months later, referred by a colonial social worker who'd run out of placements and couldn't find anyone willing to house a Tessari boy whose bioluminescence patterns were so erratic that he lit up like a distress beacon every time someone raised their voice. Leal had been carried in by a frontier medic who'd found her in a refugee column, dehydrated, her skin so dim she'd nearly been mistaken for dead. Pale had simply appeared one morning, sitting on the compound wall, clutching a stuffed toy and watching Cassius through the kitchen window with enormous ice blue eyes until Cassius had walked out, knelt beside the wall and said, "Are you hungry?" Pale had nodded. He hadn't spoken for 3 weeks after that. When he finally did, the first word he said was Cassius's name. Not Dr. Wren, just Cassius. The pronunciation was mangled, Tessari mouths weren't built for the sibilant, but it was unmistakable. Cassius had gone into the clinic supply closet after that and sat on an overturned crate for 5 minutes with his hands over his face, doing something that was not crying because retired field surgeons did not cry over a child saying their name. He descended to the kitchen, started the water heater, and began peeling tubers for the morning meal. The knife was dull. He'd been meaning to sharpen it for a week. There was never enough time. There were always more fevers, more nightmares, more shoes to cobble together from scrapped hull plating because Tessari feet grew faster than any supply shipment arrived. The water boiled. He measured out grain and powdered calcium supplement. Tessari bones were porous, prone to microfractures without supplementation, and stirred it into the pot. He'd calculated the dosage himself in the first year, working from veterinary analogs and the dead woman's journal, running blood panels every 3 months until he'd established a protocol that kept their bone density within species norms. The kind of work that no one saw and no one thanked him for. Through the kitchen window, the courtyard lay in peach-colored light. The ghost flowers were opening. A pair of boots, Tomas's, too small now, resoled twice, sat on the back step where Cassius had left them last night after gluing a patch over the worn-through heel. The glue needed 6 hours to set. Tomas would complain about the cold floor this morning until the boots were ready. He complained about everything with a theatrical intensity that masked how deeply he cared about every small comfort this place offered, because every small comfort was one he had not expected to receive. It was, by every measure, a quiet morning. The first sign of trouble was the birds. They lifted from the scrubland beyond the compound wall in a single dark sheet, wheeling east, and the silence they left behind had weight. Cassius set down the stirring spoon. He'd spent 8 years as a field surgeon in zones where birds leaving meant ordnance incoming, and his body remembered before his mind caught up. Dust, a column of it rising from the northern road. Vehicles. 3, no, 4, moving fast and tight. The formation of people who expected no resistance and wanted to arrive before anyone could organize any. His stomach dropped. He'd known this was coming. He'd known since the day, 4 months ago, when a trade liaison named Pelori Des had visited the orphanage with a smile and a datapad full of proposals. Des represented Lathane Biosolutions, a conglomerate that processed rare biochemicals for the pharmaceutical markets of the inner systems. Tessari bioluminescent compound, the substance that made the children's skin glow, had applications in neural regeneration therapy. Harvesting it was painful, invasive, and required a living donor. The compound degraded within hours of the donor's death, which meant the donors had to be kept alive, kept producing, kept in a state of sustained low-grade stress, because the compound expressed most abundantly under cortisol pressure. Des had explained this with the cadence of a man reading a quarterly earnings report. He'd used the word yield 4 times in 2 minutes. Cassius had thrown him out of the building physically, picked him up by the collar of his pressed suit and walked him backwards through the front door and deposited him in the dirt of the courtyard. Rai had been watching from the schoolroom window. She'd said nothing, but that evening she'd brought Cassius a cup of masu tea, a gesture the Tessari used to acknowledge that someone had done something worth noticing. He'd drunk it and burned his tongue because masu tea was served at temperatures that would scald human tissue, and Rai hadn't known that, and he hadn't wanted to tell her because the gesture was more important than the pain. 2 weeks later, Des had returned with a revised offer and a veiled reference to the orphanage's expired licensing. Cassius had thrown him out again, less physically, more verbally, with specific anatomical suggestions about where Des could store his revised offer. A month after that, the licensing board had revoked the Alcira Homes operating permit. Cassius had appealed. The appeal had been denied by a magistrate whose signature matched the one on Lathane Biosolutions' local charter. He'd filed a second appeal through a different jurisdiction. That one had disappeared into administrative silence. A third appeal, submitted to the Colonial Oversight Office 3 systems away, had been returned with a form letter explaining that frontier orphanage disputes fell outside their mandate. Cassius had understood then that the legal avenues were not closed, they had been removed. Every door he knocked on led to a wall with Lathane's logo embossed on it. So he'd stopped knocking on doors and started reinforcing his own. The work had taken 3 months. He'd done it at night, after the children were asleep, because he didn't want them to understand what the preparations meant. The freight-rated deadbolts came from a decommissioned cargo hauler. He traded 2 months of free medical consultations to the hauler's crew for the hardware. The cellar rewiring was harder. He taught himself the basics from a maintenance manual and bribed a retired electrician in the settlement 30 kilometers south to check his work. The ventilation system, the water supply line, the emergency lighting, each one was a problem solved with scrap materials, and the stubborn refusal to accept that a man with a medical degree couldn't learn to be a plumber, an electrician, and a carpenter when children's lives required it. The comm unit was preset to a frequency he'd been given years ago by a man he'd served with in the medical corps, Dren Halleck, now working logistics for the Tessari Unified Council's Refugee Outreach Division. Cassius had contacted Halleck 3 months ago, the day after his third appeal was returned. He'd explained the situation. Halleck had listened and then said, with the careful precision of a man speaking around what he was not authorized to say, "If you ever need to reach us in an emergency broadcast wide, we monitor the corridor relays, but I can't promise response times. The council's stretched thin and the corridor is far." It wasn't a guarantee. It was the best anyone had offered. He'd reinforced the rear entrance with a secondary bolt, replaced the schoolroom windows with shatter-resistant panels, and installed a manual alarm system that ran on a hardwired circuit Lathane couldn't jam remotely. He'd cut his own meals to 2 a day to cover the expense of the deadbolts. He hadn't told anyone that. It wasn't the kind of sacrifice that needed an audience. He'd stocked the cellar with enough water and ration bars for 3 days. He'd installed a manual ventilation crank in case the power was cut. He'd tested the comm unit twice, verifying that the signal reached at least one relay point in the corridor. The second test had been marginal. He drilled the children on the procedure twice, disguised as a game. Get to the cellar, lock the door, count heads, wait. Rai had known it wasn't a game. She'd asked him why they were really practicing. He told her the truth because Rai had survived things that made lying to her an insult. She'd nodded and said, "Show me the lock code." Then she'd asked, "What if they cut the power?" He'd shown her the manual ventilation crank. She'd asked, "What if they get through the bolts?" He hadn't had an answer for that. She'd looked at him with those steady amber eyes and said, "Then we go out the drainage tunnel." He'd blinked. She'd shown him a half-meter gap behind the water tank that connected to the building's original storm drain, a passage too small for an adult, just large enough for a Tessari child. She'd already tested it with Tomas. It emerged in the scrubland 60 meters south of the compound wall. A 12-year-old had built a backup escape route that a 53-year-old doctor had missed. Cassius had added secure the drainage tunnel exit to his preparation list and revised his assessment of Rai upward, from competent to the reason these children might survive this. And now the vehicles were coming. For 1 breath, maybe 2, Cassius stood in the kitchen with his hands on the counter and felt the full weight of what was about to happen. 23 children, 1 building, 1 man, and approaching from the north the machinery of an entity that measured children in units of compound yield per quarter. The math was not complicated. It was obscene, but it was not complicated. He had exactly one advantage. He'd been expecting this. Des had been expecting a quiet extraction. The side with more firepower always assumed compliance. They did not plan for a man who had already decided, months ago, that compliance was not available. He moved. He crossed the kitchen in 4 strides, hit the hallway, and took the stairs 2 at a time. His body was 53 years old and built like a man who'd spent his 20s hauling stretchers through mud, and it still knew how to move when children were in danger. He reached the upper landing and rapped his knuckles on the first door. Hard, 3 times. Rai's eyes snapped open. She was on her feet before the younger one stirred, her lavender-tinged skin flickering with alarm patterns. Rai, get everyone into the cellar. Now, use the back stairs. Take water and the blankets from the clinic closet. Don't use the front corridor. The girl didn't ask questions. She'd lived through worse than questions could prepare her for. She turned to the younger children and began lifting them, 2 at a time, her voice low and steady, a 12-year-old who had learned to sound like bedrock because nobody else would. Cassius moved to the next room, woke Tomas. Same instructions. Tomas had a different quality than Rai, where she was still and certain. He was quick and nervous, but his nervousness made him thorough. He checked under every bed. He pulled the blankets off the ones who tried to curl back into sleep. He counted out loud, finger pointing at each head, the way Cassius had taught him. Dr. Wren. What's happening? Company, Cassius said. The wrong kind cellar now. In the third room, a cluster of 4 had to be pried apart. They'd wound themselves into a sleeping knot, limbs intertwined, skins synchronized in a deep blue pulse that was their body's way of saying everything is fine. Cassius hated waking them from that. Hated it with a specificity that surprised him even now, 6 years in. Every time he interrupted their peace, he felt like he was breaking a promise he hadn't made but had inherited. He got them moving, down the hall, bare feet on wood, small hands finding other small hands in the half-dark. A Tessari boy named Kale, quiet, serious, with gray ashen skin that never flickered because his bioluminescence had been damaged by malnutrition before Cassius had gotten to him, walked at the rear of the group, checking over his shoulder every few steps. He was 7, maybe 8. He'd appointed himself rear guard without being asked. Cassius saw it and thought, you should not have to do that. You should be sleeping. You should be dreaming the synchronized dream. You should not know what a rear guard is. He descended again. The vehicles were closer now. He could hear the engine whine of the lead transport, a sound like a wasp trapped in a bottle. At the bottom of the stairs, he turned right, toward the clinic. Leal was still sleeping. He gathered her carefully. She weighed almost nothing, her bones like balsa wrapped in cool silk, her fever-dimmed skin still warm to the touch, and carried her to the cellar stairs at the back of the building. Rai was already there, standing at the cellar door like a traffic controller, counting children as Tomas guided them down the steps. She met Cassius's eyes and held up 9 fingers, then 10. She was tracking the count in real time. He set Leal on a cot in the corner of the cellar. She murmured something in Tessari, a fragment of whatever she'd been dreaming but didn't wake. Tomas appeared with the last cluster of children, a group of 3 who held each other's hands in a chain. Rai counted them in. 22 in the cellar. Leal made 23. No, 22. The number hit him like cold water. 22 from the dormitories plus Leal equaled 23. But something was wrong. He ran through the count again, room by room, name by name, and the error surfaced. Pale. Pale didn't sleep in the dormitories. Pale slept in the schoolroom, curled under the reading bench with his stuffed toy, because the dormitories were too loud and too close, and Pale was the kind of child who needed a quiet corner and a familiar object to feel safe enough to close his eyes. Cassius had let him because the schoolroom was warm and dry, and Pale slept better there than anywhere else. And the schoolroom was on the ground floor, on the opposite side of the building from the cellar stairs. Rai, lock it from inside. The code is 773 Ren. Don't open it for anyone but me. If I don't come back in 2 hours, there's a comm unit in the gray supply box. The frequency is preset. Press the red button and say my name. Someone will come. Rai looked at him. Her amber eyes were enormous, her pupils contracted to thin vertical slits, a Tessari stress response he'd learned over 6 years to read as fluently as any medical chart. You're not coming down here with us, she said. It wasn't a question. No. Why? Cassius crouched until his eyes were level with hers. He was aware, in a distant clinical way, that his hands were shaking. He put them on her shoulders anyway and held them steady by force of will. Because the door is the only thing between them and you. And I'm going to be standing on the other side of it. He left before she could answer. He heard the deadbolts engage behind him, 3 of them, heavy, the sound of steel doing what steel was made to do. He moved down the corridor toward the schoolroom. Pale was awake, the engines had woken him. The child was sitting under the reading bench, clutching a stuffed toy made of scrapped fabric, his ice blue skin flickering with rapid distress patterns. His eyes were the size of sensor lenses. Pale, Cassius knelt, eye level, always eye level. I need you to come with me. We're going to the safe room like the game. Pale's arms locked around the stuffed toy. He didn't move. His mouth worked but no sound came out. This happened sometimes. Tessari children under extreme stress could lose vocalization, a neurological freeze response that Cassius had seen in 4 of his 23 children and had learned to treat with patience and physical proximity. He didn't have time for patience. The vehicles were in the courtyard now. He could hear treads on packed earth, the hydraulic whine of a transport ramp lowering. He picked Pale up. The child locked onto him, arms around his neck, legs around his torso, face buried against his shoulder, a grip that was instinct rather than choice. Cassius held him with one arm and moved. The hallway stretched between him and the cellar stairs, 30 meters. He covered 20 of them before a voice from outside froze him. Dr. Wren, we know you're inside. This is Officer Vasic with a civil enforcement order. Open the front door. He kept moving, 10 meters. The cellar door was locked from inside. He hammered on it 3 times and pressed his mouth to the gap. Right, open one more. The deadbolts retracted. The door opened a crack. He slid Pale through the gap. The child's grip transferred from Cassius to Rye with the smooth precision of one anchor finding another, and the door closed again. Bolts shot home. 23, all accounted for. Cassius walked to the front entrance, opened the door, and stepped outside into the morning light. 4 vehicles. 2 transports, a command car, and a flatbed carrying modular containment cells, transparent-walled units, each roughly large enough to hold a child-sized body in a seated position. There were 24 of them on the flatbed, 1 extra. Somebody had done their research and added a margin. The efficiency of it was obscene. Pelorides stood beside the command car, wearing a pressed gray suit and a thin smile. Beside him, a woman in the uniform of a regional enforcement officer, not military, but licensed to carry weapons and execute civil orders. Her name tag read VASIK. Behind them, 8 men in lathing corporate security gear, armed with pulse stunners and restraint binders. 2 of them carried cutting tools on their belts, the kind used to breach locked doors. Des stepped forward. Dr. Wren, I have a court order authorizing the immediate transfer of all minors currently housed in this facility to Lathing Biosolutions Licensed Care Center on Korath Station. The facility's operating permit has been permanently revoked. You are required to surrender the children and vacate the premises within 1 hour. Cassius stood in the doorway. He was wearing the clothes he'd slept in, a faded medical tunic, canvas trousers, boots that needed resoling. He didn't have a weapon. He didn't have a legal team. He didn't have a fleet or a title or a government behind him. He had a doorway. And behind that doorway, down a corridor, behind 3 freight-rated deadbolts, 23 children were sitting in a cellar trusting him to be enough. He was a 53-year-old doctor with bad knees and no weapon and a broadband comm that might or might not reach anyone who cared. He was not enough. He was what they had. No, he said. Des's smile tightened. Dr. Wren, this is a lawful civil order signed by magistrate. A magistrate on your payroll, an operating permit revoked by a board your company chairs, a licensed care center that exists as a filing number on Korath Station and nowhere in physical space. Cassius kept his voice flat. surgical, the same tone he'd used for 30 years to deliver information that no one wanted to hear. I know what you want the children for, Des. I know what harvesting tessari bioluminescent compound involves. Subcutaneous microtaps inserted along the dorsal nerve cluster. Cortisol stimulation to increase compound expression. Luminescence cycling that requires the donor to be kept in a state of sustained physiological distress. He paused. I know the survival rate for donors under 10 standard years. Do you? Something moved behind Des's eyes. Not guilt. Men like Des had excised guilt early and cleanly. Irritation. The annoyance of a man whose technical language had just been spoken back to him by someone who understood it better than he did. The survival rate is not relevant to this order, Des said. 31%. 7 children out of 22 died in the first year of your company's clinical trials. Your own filing with the Korath Pharmaceutical Board, sealed under commercial privacy. I pulled it before they sealed it. 7 children, Des. Your company documented their deaths as acceptable attrition and moved to the next phase. Vasek's head turned. She looked at Des. 1 second, the kind of look that recalibrated everything that came after it. Officer Vasek, Des said, his voice stripped of smoothness, remove Dr. Wren from the premises. Vasek stepped forward. She stopped 3 meters from the doorway, stunner on her hip, restraint binders on her belt. Doctor, I'm authorized to use force. Please step aside. Officer Vasek, have you read the order you're executing? I have. Then you know it classifies 23 Tessari orphans as unclaimed biological assets eligible for corporate custody transfer. Not children, assets. The same legal category as mineral deposits and salvageable ship components. Vasek's jaw tightened. Not indifference suppression. She'd read the order, she'd noticed the language, and she'd done what people did when noticing was inconvenient. The legal classification is not my concern, she said. It should be, because the moment you cross this threshold to take a child classified as an asset, you're not a peace officer executing a custody order. You're a collection agent retrieving property, and the children inside that cellar are not property. Something shifted behind Vasek's eyes. Not a change of mind, the first crack in the wall between what she'd been told and what she was beginning to understand. Step aside, Doctor. Cassius did not step aside. He leaned his shoulder against the doorframe and crossed his arms. It was a posture that invited exactly the kind of physical confrontation that would look terrible in any subsequent review. Vasek knew it. She stopped. Corporal, she said to one of the security men, go around. Find another entrance. Cassius felt his pulse spike. The back door was locked with the freight-rated deadbolt. It would hold for a while, but the cutting tools on those belts could get through the hinges. There is no other entrance, he said, a lie delivered in the flat tone of a man who had been telling patients hard truths for 3 decades. The corporal hesitated. Vasek nodded. He moved. Cassius had minutes, not hours. He needed to make this loud enough that someone with real authority would notice before the containment cells on that flatbed had occupants. He pulled his personal comm from his pocket and opened a broadband channel, the kind of transmission that anyone within range with a receiver would pick up. This is Dr. Cassius Wren, Colonial Medical Corps, retired. Registration number CMC 7714 Terran. I am broadcasting from the Alsara Orphanage, Tessari Corridor, grid reference 847 by 229. Lathane Biosolutions is currently attempting to forcibly remove 23 Tessari orphans from this facility for the purpose of commercial bioluminescent compound harvesting. I have documentation of Lathane's clinical trials showing a 31% child mortality rate among minor donors. I am requesting immediate assistance from any authority, military, or humanitarian body within range. The children are secured, but the facility is being breached. This is not a drill. This is a doctor asking for help. He set the comm to loop. Every 30 seconds, the message would repeat on every frequency. He placed the device on the windowsill. Des's composure cracked. The thin smile was gone. "Turn that off," he said. "Turn it off now." "No. You're broadcasting confidential corporate data. The clinical trials are sealed under commercial privacy. Children's death rates aren't corporate secrets, Des. They're evidence." Two of the security men exchanged a glance. The older one had his hand on his stunner but hadn't drawn it. The younger one, barely into his 20s, took his hand off his stunner entirely and put it behind his back. A third security man, positioned near the flatbed, spoke up. "Sir, the units on the flatbed, the interior configurations, those are pediatric restraint mounts. The wrist clamps are child-sized." "I'm aware of the specifications," Des said. "I wasn't." The man's voice had gone flat. "When I signed on for asset security, nobody briefed me on pediatric restraints. Your briefing is not relevant to. I'm not loading children into those things, Mr. Des." It was the first open defection from Des's team, and it rippled. From somewhere behind the building came a thud and a curse. The corporal had found the rear door. The freight-rated deadbolt held. The cutting tool would take time. Cassius estimated 15 to 20 minutes. Des pulled his own comm and spoke into it rapidly. One phrase came through clearly because Des said it twice. "Extraction timeline at risk. Not the children are at risk. The extraction timeline. 23 lives, and the concern was logistics." "Vasek, clear the doorway, now. The broadcast needs to stop." Vasek drew her stunner. Cassius watched her thumb the safety. He didn't move. His knees ached. His back hurt from 3 nights in the clinic chair. He was 53 years old and hadn't held a weapon in 8 years. But he had held children. He had held Leal through fevers that turned her skin white-hot. He had held Tomas through nightmares where the boy's skin flickered in panic patterns so rapid they strobed. He had held Pale on his lap during thunderstorms because Tessari children processed low-frequency sound through their entire nervous system, and every crack of thunder was a full-body assault. He had held them, and he was not going to hand them over. "Go ahead," he said to Vasek. "Stun me. Drag me out. It's all on broadcast now. Every ship, every station, every monitoring post in the corridor is hearing this. You stun a retired doctor standing unarmed in a doorway defending orphans from commercial harvesting, and that's the story. Not lawful transfer, not corporate custody. The headline is, 'Armed officers stun unarmed doctor to seize alien children for pharmaceutical extraction.' That follows you, Officer Vasek. Your name, your record, forever." Vasek's stunner didn't waver, but her finger didn't move to the trigger. She was weighing duty against consequence, the order in her hand against the broadcast in the air, and the number 31% hanging between them. From behind the building, the cutting tool whined to life, a high, thin scream of metal on metal. The corporal was working on the rear door's hinges. Each second of that sound was a countdown. If he breached the rear door, the cellar was 30 meters away. The deadbolts would hold. But the hinges were standard residential hardware. Cassius had reinforced the lock, not the frame. A cutting tool on the hinges would take 15 minutes, maybe less. The comm on the windowsill looped. Cassius's voice, flat and clinical, repeating the facts into the corridor's airwaves. Lathane Biosolutions, 23 orphans, bioluminescent compound harvesting, 31% mortality. Every 30 seconds, the same words, the same numbers, the same request for help that might be heard by someone or might be dissolving into static between dead relay buoys. He had no way of knowing which, so he stood in the doorway and he kept talking. Des snapped his fingers at 2 of the remaining security men. "The schoolroom windows, now. There are shatter-resistant panels. Use the pry tools. Get inside, find another route to wherever he's hidden them." The two men moved toward the building's east side. Cassius couldn't leave the doorway. The moment he moved, Des would push through. He raised his voice, loud enough that the comm would pick it up. For the record, the schoolroom windows have been replaced with military-grade shatter-resistant panels. While your men are wasting time on those, I'll add to the broadcast. Let's talk about Lathane Biosolutions operations on Keras 4. Des went still. Keras 4, Cassius repeated. A mining colony with a Tessari refugee settlement. Lathane established a health clinic there 18 months ago. Within 6 months, 31 Tessari children, all under 12 standard years, were transferred to Korath Station for advanced medical treatment. None of them returned. The settlement filed missing persons reports. The reports were routed to a magistrate on Lathane's payroll, filed under resolved custody transfer. 31 children vanished into a corporate facility, and the paperwork says resolved. Des went white. Not the controlled pallor of stress, but the full-body drain of a man hearing information he had believed was buried. That is privileged corporate. I have the transfer manifests. I have the filing numbers. All of it is on a data chip in a sealed envelope addressed to the Tessari Unified Council's Criminal Investigation Division. If I don't transmit a safety code every 48 hours, the envelope opens automatically. That was a bluff. There was no data chip, no sealed envelope, no dead man's switch. But Cassius had spent enough time reading Lathane's public filings to know that Keras 4 was real, that the children were real, and that the number 31 was close enough to accurate that Des couldn't dismiss it. From the east side of the building, he heard the scrape of pry tools against the reinforced schoolroom panels. A grunt, a curse. The panels held. The two men walked back into view, shaking their heads. "Pull back," Des said. His voice was stripped of everything that wasn't tactical necessity. Something fundamental had shifted in the courtyard's geometry. Cassius was no longer just an obstacle in a doorway. He was a man with information, broadcasting it, and every minute that passed made the information harder to contain. But Des was not retreating. He was recalculating. If he got the children into the cells and off-world before the broadcast generated a response, the response wouldn't matter. Possession was its own jurisdiction. "I want to show you something else, Vasek." Cassius kept his voice steady, conversational, the voice of a man with nothing to lose except everything. "The containment cells on that flatbed, 24 of them. Each one has a built-in physiological monitoring suite. You can see the sensor strips on the interior walls, cortisol readers, luminescence meters, stress response indicators. Those aren't medical instruments. They're production gauges. They measure how much compound a child is producing and adjust the stress stimulus accordingly." Vasek's eyes moved to the flatbed. She looked at the cells for the first time, really looked, not at the units as cargo, but at the instruments embedded in their walls. "Every cell has a manual override labeled stimulus increment," Cassius continued. "In the literature, that means increasing the cortisol trigger. In practice, with a child donor, it means inducing additional distress when output drops below the commercial threshold. The younger the donor, the more stimulus is required to maintain yield. Children under 6 standard years require near-constant cortisol adjustment, which presents as sustained physiological distress indistinguishable from." "Stop." Vasek's voice was tight. Not anger. Something worse than anger, the sound of a person whose professional detachment was failing under the weight of specifics. "I will not stop talking, because in 20 minutes your corporal is going to breach my back door, and in 30 minutes those cells are going to have children in them, and in 6 hours those children are going to be on Korath Station with microtaps in their spines and cortisol injectors in their arms, and you are going to have to live with that. Not Des. Not Lathane. You." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Cassius had ever heard. It lasted 3 seconds. It lasted a career. Vasek lowered her stunner. Not slowly fast, with the decisive motion of someone who had found a better order than the one she'd been following. She holstered the weapon, snapped the retention strap, and unclipped the restraint binders from her belt. She set them on the ground. "I'm standing down," she said. "I'm not executing this order, Mr. Des. The classification of minors as biological assets for the purpose of involuntary medical extraction falls under Article 7 of the Post-Corridor Accords." She straightened. "You want to breach that door, you do it without me." The two security men behind her stepped back. The younger one removed his corporate security badge and dropped it in the dirt. Des stood in the courtyard with a court order disintegrating in his hands. The cutting tool behind the building had gone silent. "This is a direct violation of your contract, Vasek," Lathing will. "File a complaint." Vasek turned her back on him. Des pulled out his comm again. He began speaking with a new urgency, not to his legal team this time. Cassius could tell from the cadence. This was a call up the chain. To someone with more authority, more resources, more willingness to do what a regional enforcement officer had just refused to do. Cassius watched him and understood. This wasn't over. Vasek standing down bought time, but Des had infrastructure behind him, regional managers, private military contractors on retainer. The broadcast was running. Help might come. But might was a fragile word to build a future on. Des finished his call. He turned toward Cassius with an expression that had abandoned pretense entirely. "You know this doesn't end here, Ren." Des's voice was low, meant for Cassius alone, not for the broadcast. "I walk away today, I come back tomorrow with private security, not local enforcement, contracted operators who don't have Vasek's crisis of conscience. Your broadcast buys you a news cycle, maybe two. After that, the corridor moves on to the next story, and Lathing's lawyers file an injunction against the broadcast as defamation, and the magistrate issues a new order, and the next officer who comes to this door won't stop to read Article 7. Cassius looked at him. "You're right," he said. "That's probably exactly what happens." "Then what is the point of this?" Genuine bewilderment had crept into Des's voice, the confusion of a man encountering a variable that didn't compute. "You can't win. You don't have the resources. You don't have legal standing. You don't have anything. I have this doorway, and I have today. And today those children are not getting into your cells." Des shook his head. He took a step toward the door, then another. He was close enough now that Cassius could smell his cologne, something synthetic, something that cost more than a month of the orphanage's medical supplies. "Move, Ren." Cassius didn't move. Des put a hand on Cassius's chest and pushed. It was not a strong push. Des was a man who moved paper. Not people, but it was a push. And it was on record. And Cassius let the momentum carry him back exactly 1 centimeter before he planted his feet and became something that Des's hand could not move. 53 years old. 8 years of field surgery. 20 years before that of medical school and residency and night shifts and carrying bodies and learning that the human frame, when it decided to hold a position, could be an extraordinary thing. Des pushed again. Harder. Cassius didn't shift, didn't retaliate, didn't raise his hands. He just stood there, a wall in a doorway, and let Des exhaust himself against the simple physics of a man who was not going to move. Des stepped back. His hand was shaking. Not from exertion, from something closer to the edge of a realization he wasn't ready to have. He retreated to the command car, pulled out his comm again, spoke rapidly, urgently, with the rising pitch of a man demanding escalation from people who were running out of escalation to offer. Cassius stood in the doorway and he waited. The sun had climbed higher. The ghost flowers in the courtyard had reached full bloom, their silver petals catching the light and throwing it back in cold pinpoints that danced across the compound walls. Cassius's legs ached. His back was a sustained complaint from 3 nights in the clinic chair. The adrenaline that had carried him through the evacuation and the first phase of the confrontation was metabolizing now, leaving behind the familiar residue of exhaustion and the kind of clarity that came when the body accepted it had nothing left and the mind took over. He'd operated in this state before 12-hour surgeries in field hospitals where the shelling didn't stop and the generators kept failing, and the only thing keeping him upright was the absolute refusal to let the patient on the table become a statistic. This was the same thing, different table, same refusal. From the kitchen, the smell of burned grain drifted through the hallway. 23 children would be hungry when this was over. The dull knife was still on the counter. The routine would resume. That was the promise embedded in every mundane task he performed in this building. The routine would resume because the alternative was unacceptable. From inside the building, through the walls and the floor and the cellar's reinforced door, he thought he could hear something faint, almost subsonic. The children, not crying, not speaking, something else. A low harmonic that vibrated in the floorboards. Tessari children under collective stress sometimes produced a communal frequency, a shared sound that was not a word and not a song but was specifically, biologically, a signal that said we are together and we are waiting and we are not alone. It was the sound of 23 children trusting a door and the man standing in front of it. Then the sound came from above. Low, atmospheric, felt in the bones before it registered, as sound the harmonic thrum of a ship descending through atmosphere. Not a shuttle, something that displaced enough air to make the ghost flowers in the courtyard bow their silver heads and the dust rise in concentric rings. Cassius didn't look up. He watched Vasek's face instead. She'd stopped halfway to her vehicle and turned skyward, and what he saw there, the upward flick of her eyes, the fractional drop of her jaw, the way her already holstered weapon hand fell completely to her side, told him everything he needed to know. The shadow fell across the compound like an eclipse. The temperature dropped as sunlight was replaced by a matte gray hull that blocked the sky from horizon to wall. The downdraft pressed Cassius's hair flat and scattered the court order's hard copies across the dirt. Des staggered. A security man grabbed the command car for balance. The ship settled into a hover, not landing, hovering at an altitude that said we could land, but we choose not to. An access ramp extended. 3 figures descended. The first was a Tessari woman, taller than any Tessari Cassius had seen, with deep sapphire skin and silver hair cropped close to her skull. Her clothing was severe, dark, cut in the angular lines of governance caste. Her amber eyes held the hardness of someone who made decisions about the fates of populations and slept soundly because the decisions were correct. Beside her walked 2 figures in Tessari military armor, not the scavenged patchwork of the corridor wars, but the formal armor of the Tessari Unified Council's protective guard. White, edged with silver, carrying a faint bioluminescent trace along the seams. The woman stopped 6 meters from Cassius. She looked at him, the faded tunic, the unshorn jaw, the posture of a man leaning on a doorframe because it was the only thing between armed adults and sleeping children. She looked at the containment cells. She looked at Des. "I am Counselor Athene Wren of the Tessari Unified Council." Her standard was accented but precise, each consonant placed like a surgical instrument. "We received a broadband distress call from this location 11 minutes ago. Under Article 12 of the Post-Corridor Accords, any facility housing Tessari minors falls under the protective jurisdiction of the Unified Council, superseding all local licensing, civil orders, and corporate custody claims." She paused. The pause was a weapon. Which means every person present who is attempting to remove those children is committing an act of state abduction. Des's mouth opened. No sound came out. He looked at the scattered papers, at the containment cells, at the legal scaffolding that had seemed so solid an hour ago. It had never been architecture. It had been kindling. "The clinical trial data referenced in the broadcast," Wren continued, has been forwarded to the Council's Criminal Investigation Division. A formal inquiry will begin within the standard day. The faintest edge entered her voice. I understand Officer Vasic has already familiarized herself with Article 7. Vasic, standing between her vehicle and the courtyard with her stunner holstered and her binders on the ground, met the counselor's gaze. Something passed between the two women, not warmth, not solidarity, but the mutual acknowledgement of people who understood what it cost to refuse an order, and what it meant to have that refusal witnessed by someone with the authority to validate it. Officer Vasic, Wren said, her voice aimed differently now, the way a blade changes angle. You may stand down formally. Your conduct in declining to execute an unlawful order will be entered into the record as commended. The Council will be requesting your testimony during the inquiry. I trust you'll be available. I'll be available, Vasic said. She straightened, not standing at attention exactly, but with something that resembled it. The posture of a person who had found, in the worst morning of her career, the outline of the officer she'd originally intended to be. She walked to the enforcement vehicle. Her unit followed. The younger security man looked at his badge in the dirt and left it there. The third man, the one who'd identified the pediatric restraints, paused beside Cassius on his way past the doorway. I have a daughter, he said. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Wren turned to Des. Two council guards flanked him without being told. Their body language was specific. We would like you to resist. Mr. Des, your containment cells will be catalogued and sealed as evidence. Your corporate charter in this corridor will be suspended pending the inquiry. I would advise your legal counsel to begin preparing for a very different kind of hearing than you're accustomed to. Des climbed into the command car with the mechanical movements of a man whose operating system had crashed. The corporal emerged from behind the building, cutting tool in hand, and stopped dead when he saw the Tessari ship. He looked at the tool. He looked at the sky. He set it on the ground with exaggerated care and walked to the transport vehicle without looking back. The vehicles reversed down the northern road, trailing dust. Council guards began deploying from the ship's secondary ramps, a dozen of them, moving with the quiet efficiency of a force that had done this before. They secured the compound perimeter. They photographed the containment cells from every angle, documenting the cortisol readers and the stimulus increment dials, and the pediatric restraint mounts with the systematic thoroughness of people building a case. Counselor Wren climbed the 3 steps to the orphanage entrance and stopped beside Cassius, who was still in the doorway because his legs had submitted their formal resignation. You held a doorway against armed men, she said, with no weapon, no authority, and no guarantee that anyone was listening. Someone was listening. We almost weren't. She looked at him directly. Your broadcast reached a monitoring buoy that had been decommissioned 6 months ago. A maintenance error left its receiver active. The margin between this outcome and the alternative was a piece of broken equipment that did its job one last time. Cassius processed that. 23 children's futures hanging on a machine that someone had forgotten to turn off. He was a doctor. He believed in evidence, in protocols, in the hard mechanics of biology and physics. He did not believe in luck or providence. But the buoy had relayed, and the ship had come. He would accept the evidence and not interrogate the mechanism. The children, Wren said, may I see them? He studied her face. It was built for governance, high cheekbones, a jaw like a blade, composure that read as admirable or frightening depending on which side of it you stood. But her eyes, when she said, children, did something governance couldn't manufacture. They shifted, by exactly the degree that separated duty from something older and less controllable. Follow me, he said. He led her through the hallway, past the kitchen where the tubers were half peeled and the grain pot had boiled dry, past the clinic where Leal's cot was empty and the fever watch chair still held his body's impression. He stopped at the cellar door. He knocked 3 times, the pattern. Rai, it's me, it's safe. You can open the door. 1 second, 2, 3. Then the sound of 3 deadbolts retracting, heavy and deliberate, each one a small act of trust extended against every reason not to extend it. The door opened. Rai stood there with hands that hadn't shaken once since the bolts had first engaged, with 22 smaller children arranged behind her in the careful geometry of someone who had counted them, and not taken her eyes off the door for a single second since it closed. Leal was awake now, sitting up on her cot, her skin returned to its healthy cerulean. She was holding Pale's hand. At some point during the wait, Pale had stopped clutching his stuffed toy and reached for another child, and Leal had taken his grip even while her own body was fighting the last of the fever. Children taking care of children. Because that was what they'd learned to do in a galaxy that kept failing them. Tomas was standing at the back of the group, his posture rigid, his mint-green skin still pale with the residue of alarm. When he saw Cassius, something in his posture unlocked not a collapse, not tears, but a settling, the way a structure that has been braced against wind relaxes when the wind stops. He gave Cassius a single nod, man to man, 12 years old, and he'd held his position. Cassius nodded back. It was enough. Counselor Wren descended the cellar steps. She stopped halfway. She looked at the cots, the water bottles, the emergency blankets, the comm unit in the gray supply box, the freight-rated deadbolts, the ventilation system, the backup lighting. Every quiet, careful preparation of a man who had known this day was coming and had built the only fortress he could afford. "You prepared for this," she said. "I've been preparing since the day Des first walked through my door." Wren's eyes moved across the children, their faces, their species cues, the evidence of care in their clean clothing and supplemented bones, and the small competencies that 6 years of patient work had built. She was reading the room the way Cassius read a patient, systematically, looking for what was present and what was absent. "Dr. Wren, the Unified Council has been searching for the corridor orphans for 2 years. Most of the ones we found were in conditions that," she stopped, recomposed. "We did not expect to find 23 in one place, healthy. Educated." She searched for the word and hesitated before it. "Loved," she said. Cassius didn't answer that. Love wasn't a clinical term. It wasn't in his training. What he did was cook meals and set bones and stay awake during fevers and build deadbolts because the world outside was full of men who looked at children and saw revenue. He didn't have a word for it. He had the doing of it. "The council will provide full protective status for this facility," Wren said. "Permanent, funded, staffed, legal standing under the council's charter that no local magistrate, licensing board, or corporation can revoke." She looked at him. "On one condition." "Which is?" "You stay, you continue running it. These children know you, they trust you. That is not something we can replicate with funding or expertise or good intentions. I have seen council-run facilities. They are adequate. The children in them survive." She paused. "Surviving is not the same as what I see here." "Counselor," he said, "I was never going to leave." Wren nodded. She didn't smile, her face wasn't built for it, but something in her posture settled, a deep structural shift, like a foundation finding stone. She descended the remaining steps and crouched among the children, not from protocol, from instinct. She spoke in Tessari. Rai translated for the younger ones. The younger children watched Wren with the enormous, cautious eyes of beings who had learned that adults arrived in 2 categories, the kind who helped and the kind who took, and had not yet determined which category this one belonged to. A small girl named Vesa, who had arrived at the orphanage 8 months ago with burns on her arms from a transit pod fire that had killed every adult in her group, detached from the cluster and walked toward Wren. Vesa didn't speak. She hadn't spoken since her arrival, but she reached out one small hand and touched the edge of Wren's sleeve, the dark fabric of the governance caste clothing, and held it between 2 fingers, feeling the texture. Then she looked up at Ren's face and, apparently satisfied by whatever she found there, sat down beside her and leaned against her leg. Ren went very still, not the stillness of surprise but the stillness of a person being careful not to break something fragile that had just been placed in their hands. She looked at Cassius. There was a question in her eyes, not what do I do, but is this what they do? She's saying hello, Cassius said, in her own way. Ren placed one hand, very gently, on the top of Vess's silver head. The child's skin brightened by a fraction, the Tessari equivalent of a held breath released. One by one, the other children began to move, not toward Ren, toward Cassius. Pale detached from Leal and walked up the cellar steps, stuffed toy in one hand, and pressed himself against Cassius's leg without a word. Kale came next, standing beside Cassius with the quiet gravity of a soldier reporting that his post was secure. Two of the younger girls followed, one of them carrying a blanket that she draped over Cassius's arm, as if tucking him in for a sleep he hadn't had in 3 days. Cassius looked down at the children arranging themselves around him and felt something crack open in his chest that he'd been holding closed with clinical discipline and surgical precision for 6 years. It wasn't grief. It wasn't relief. It was something that didn't have a name in the medical literature, because medicine didn't have a term for the moment when you realized that the people you'd been protecting had been protecting you back, in ways you'd been too busy surviving to notice. He put one hand on Pale's head, the other on Kale's shoulder. He stood there, a man made of door frame and stubbornness and the accumulated weight of 6 years of small, relentless acts of care, and he let the children hold him up. And then something happened that Cassius had never seen in 6 years of living among Tessari children. They began to glow. Not the distress-pattern flickering of alarm, not the synchronized sleep pulse, something different. A slow, deep, steady luminescence that started in the youngest and spread outward, child to child, until the cellar filled with soft blue-silver light that had no analog in any database Cassius had ever consulted. It was warm, calm. It pulsed in a rhythm that wasn't heartbeat and wasn't breathing, but was something communal and ancient and specifically Tessari. Rai looked up at him. Her eyes were bright with reflected light, her expression the most unguarded he had ever seen. "It means safe," she said. "It's what we do when the danger is gone and the person who kept us safe is still here." The light moved through the cellar like a tide, touching every surface, the cots, the water bottles, the deadbolts, the walls that had held, the door that had not been breached. It touched Ren, who knelt among the children with her governance composure replaced by something older and more important. It touched Cassius, standing at the top of the stairs, leaning against the doorframe because his legs had finally and irrevocably quit. Below him, 23 children glowed in a color that had no human name, pulsing together in a rhythm that meant safe, that meant here, that meant the door held and the person behind it did not move. Morning light poured through the cellar's high window and caught silver hair and blue skin, and the quiet aftermath of a crisis survived not by force, not by fleet, not by authority or law, but by a man who had decided 6 years ago that these children were his and had never reconsidered. His tubers were still unpeeled. His grain had boiled dry. There was a stuffed toy in the schoolroom that needed returning. Tomorrow he would fix the rear door, file the protective status paperwork, and write a report for the Tessari Unified Council that would require him to use the word bioluminescent more times than any human should in a single document. He would cook dinner for 23 children who would eat as if nothing had happened, because children had the extraordinary capacity to resume being children the moment an adult gave them permission. But that was tomorrow. Right now the children were glowing, the building was standing, the door had held. And the doctor was still in it,